Here is something that most people have no idea exists. There are official rules, written down, voted on by an international body of scientists, revised, updated, and formally ratified just weeks ago. Rules for exactly what happens, step by step, the moment humanity detects a confirmed signal from an extraterrestrial intelligence. Who gets told first? Who is allowed to speak publicly? Who is absolutely forbidden from sending a response? And most importantly, what we would actually say if we decided to reply. These rules are real. They have existed in some form since 1989, and the fact that almost nobody outside the scientific community knows they exist tells you something important about how seriously the people closest to this question are taking the possibility that it will no longer be hypothetical. What follows is what those rules actually say, what they reveal about the staggering difficulty of the problem they are trying to solve, and why the question of what humanity would say to an alien civilization turns out to be one of the most philosophically complex questions our species has ever faced. Start with what happens in the first minutes and hours after a detection. The 2026 Declaration, formally ratified by the International Academy of Astronautics (SETI) Committee in June of 2026, the most significant update to these protocols in the 37 years they have existed, lays out a specific sequence. The scientist or team that detects a candidate's signal does not immediately call a press conference. They do not post on social media. They do not even tell their own institution's public relations department. The first step is verification. The team must attempt to independently confirm the signal using different instruments, different locations, or different analysis methods. The reason is fundamental and reflects a hard lesson from recent history. In 2020, a signal apparently detected from Proxima Centauri generated enormous excitement for nearly 2 years before being traced to terrestrial interference. The emotional and reputational cost of announcing a false positive would be severe enough that the protocol requires confirmation before any public disclosure. But here's the detail that reveals how different this world has become from the one in which the original 1989 protocols were written. One of the most significant additions to the 2026 Declaration is an entire section devoted to social media and information leaks. The authors explicitly acknowledge that in the current information environment, a major scientific discovery cannot realistically be kept secret for any extended period. The protocol does not try to suppress the information. It tries to ensure that when the information becomes public, it does so with enough verified context that the initial announcement does not trigger a wave of misinformation that becomes impossible to correct. Once verification is complete, the declaration specifies a cascade of notifications. The Secretary General of the United Nations is informed. The International Astronomical Union is informed. The relevant heads of state of the countries whose facilities made the detection are informed. Only after this governmental and institutional notification is the general public told. Through a coordinated announcement designed to provide not just the fact of the detection but the scientific context, the confidence level of the verification, and the significant uncertainties that remain. The 2026 Declaration is also explicit on a point that its 1989 predecessor was less clear about. The announcement of a detection is not the same as the announcement of what was detected. A signal that is confirmed as artificial in origin, as not explainable by any known natural phenomenon, does not automatically reveal anything about who sent it, what they want, or what the signal contains. The discovery of a locked door is not the same as the discovery of what is behind it. And then comes the question that the protocols wrestle with most carefully, and what do we say back? The most controversial section of the 2026 Declaration, and the one that has generated the most debate within the scientific community, covers what researchers call METI, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. The deliberate act of composing and transmitting a response, and the Declaration's position on this is clear, firm, and deliberately conservative. No reply should be sent until there has been broad international consultation. No single researcher, observatory, nation, or private company is authorized to send a response on behalf of humanity. Any reply must go through the United Nations or another broadly representative global body, through a process that gives all of humanity some meaningful role in deciding what is said. This position is firmer than the language in any previous version of the protocol, and it exists because the scientific community has recognized something that most people have never had to think about. Deciding what humanity says to another civilization is not a scientific question. It is the most consequential political and philosophical question our species has ever faced. And right now, there is no mechanism on Earth capable of answering it. To understand why that problem is so difficult, you need to understand what any message to an alien civilization is actually trying to accomplish. And the moment you try to specify that, the complexity becomes almost immediately overwhelming. The most basic approach, and the one that humanity has actually used in the few cases where we have sent deliberate interstellar messages, is mathematics. The logic is elegant and has serious scientific support. Mathematics describes the structure of physical reality in ways that any sufficiently advanced civilization would have had to discover, regardless of its biological origin, its sensory equipment, or its cultural history. Prime numbers are prime in any number system. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is the same on every planet. The atomic number of hydrogen is 1 everywhere in the observable universe. A message built from mathematical relationships that any physics-understanding civilization would recognize provides the foundation for a shared vocabulary that does not depend on shared biology or shared language. The 1974 Arecibo Message worked exactly this way. Frank, Drake, and Carl Sagan encoded a transmission of 1,679 binary digits, specifically chosen because 1,679 is the product of two prime numbers, 23 and 73. Any civilization receiving a stream of 1,679 bits and recognizing that its length factors into two primes would know to arrange it into a grid of those dimensions. Doing so reveals a pictogram containing the numbers 1 through 10, the atomic numbers of the elements essential to life on Earth, a representation of DNA's double helix structure, a diagram of a human figure, and an image of the solar system. In 3 minutes of radio transmission, humanity encoded the most fundamental facts about our biology, our chemistry, and our location. It was a remarkable intellectual achievement and a genuine attempt to communicate across the cosmic gulf, using only the shared language of physics and mathematics. But the Arecibo Message also illustrates the limits of the approach. It assumes that the receiving civilization shares our mathematical framework. It assumes they perceive and process information in ways that would allow them to recognize a two-dimensional image encoded in a binary string. It assumes they understand the relationship between atomic numbers and elements in the way our periodic table represents it. These are reasonable assumptions for a civilization that has developed radio technology and physics. But they are assumptions, and the 2026 protocols grapple explicitly with the possibility that these assumptions might not hold. For all types of alien intelligence, particularly for machine intelligences or for biological intelligences whose sensory and cognitive architecture is sufficiently different from ours that the structures we consider universal may not be universal for them. The deeper problem is not linguistic, it is representational. A message to an alien civilization must make choices about what aspects of humanity to represent, and those choices are not neutral. If we emphasize our scientific achievements, we present ourselves as a technological civilization and may be communicating something about our relationship to nature, to each other, and to power that we have not thought through. If we include art, music, or literature, we are making assumptions about whether aesthetic experience translates across biological and cognitive boundaries that we have no way of verifying. If we include information about human conflict, inequality, and environmental damage, we are being honest but potentially signaling something about our stability and trustworthiness that might not serve us well in a first contact context. And if we exclude those things, we are presenting a version of humanity that is not accurate. Every choice is a representation, and every representation is a political act, reflecting the values and priorities of whoever made the choice. This is the problem that no protocol can fully solve, and that the 2026 Declaration handles by deferring to a process rather than prescribing a content. The Declaration does not say what humanity should communicate. It says that the decision of what to communicate belongs to all of humanity, through a process yet to be designed. Professor Michael Garrett, who chairs the IAA SETI committee and led the 2026 revision, described the post-detection protocols as less a rulebook than a mirror, a document that forces humanity to ask what kind of civilization we hope to be when the stars finally answer. That framing is accurate and important, because the question of what we would say to an alien civilization is not ultimately a question about linguistics or mathematics or even science. It is a question about self-knowledge, about whether humanity has a coherent enough understanding of itself, its values, its history, and its aspirations, to represent itself honestly and intentionally to something completely outside our experience. There is a specific debate within the scientific community that reveals exactly how far from consensus humanity currently is on this question. A significant number of researchers, including Stephen Hawking before his death, have argued that sending any response at all is dangerous. The dark forest logic applies here directly. If advanced civilizations are hiding because revealing your location is a survival risk, then responding to a detected signal is an announcement of our location and our existence to whatever is listening. Hawking argued publicly and repeatedly that initiating or responding to contact was among the most dangerous things humanity could do, comparing it to indigenous peoples encountering European explorers, and noting that the historical outcomes of that contact were not primarily determined by the intentions of either party but by the disparity in capabilities. The METI debate within the SETI community is not settled. Researchers are divided not just on what to say, but on whether to say anything at all. And the 2026 Declaration, by requiring broad international consultation before any response is authorized, effectively ensures that this debate must be resolved, publicly and collectively, before humanity speaks. What makes the question even harder is the time constraint that most discussions of this topic overlook entirely. If a signal arrives from the nearest potentially inhabited star system, the Proxima Centauri system roughly 4 light-years away, any response we send takes 4 years to arrive, and any reply to that response takes another 4 years to reach us. An exchange of even a few messages spans a human generation. If the signal comes from something further, as most potentially habitable systems would be, the exchange spans centuries or millennia. This means that any message we send is not a conversation, it is a statement, a document that will represent humanity for longer than most human institutions have existed. The question of what to say becomes the question of what we want to be remembered as saying, across a time span that dwarfs any previous human communication, and to an audience that nothing in our cultural history has prepared us to address. And yet the 2026 Declaration, with its detailed protocols for verification, notification, consultation, and the careful, deliberate, internationally coordinated crafting of any eventual response, represents something genuinely remarkable. It is evidence that a community of scientists has decided this question is worth taking seriously enough to write rules for it, not because contact is certain, because the probability is no longer low enough to ignore. The protocols exist not as a prediction that we will need them, but as a preparation for the possibility that we might. And the fact that the most significant revision to those protocols in their entire history was completed and ratified in June of 2026, while the first government UAP file releases were making headlines around the world, is a coincidence that may or may not be meaningful, but it is worth noting. The people who spend their careers listening are updating their rules for what happens when something answers. Whatever that tells you about the current state of this question, it tells you that the people closest to it are no longer treating the answer as purely theoretical.